so glad you could turn out and join us this evening. This is the Henderson Lecture at the District Medical History Center. Happily this year it coincides with the Humanities Week, so we have some crossover pollination between events on campus. We're very happy about that. And I'm especially happy to have Heather Perry here this evening for this talk. I met Heather in 2003 at a conference in Manchester, England. It was on medicine and technology, sponsored by the Center for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine there. And you were probably about the second year in your graduate studies at the time?
Just trucking along.
About there. And it was one of those meetings where people came from all over the world to talk about this topic, and they actually held the meeting in a college where so you had your meals with the same people, and the lodging was all there. It was a really great and stimulating environment, and I really thought it was marvelous, and came back with my new batteries recharged. And the other convergence that we have tonight is that Jennifer Nieves, in the front row here, the archivist and museum registrar, has been working for the last 2 years, maybe? How long? 6 years, snowballs, on the Lakeside unit. In the First World War, there was a group of Clevelanders, most of them coming out of what was Lakeside Hospital, who coalesced and provided the staffing for Base Hospital number 4. They actually went over to France before that to figure out what was the nature of war wounds that people were experiencing, how would they cope with it, because they knew sooner or later America would be in the war. It was just a matter of time. And so Jenny's got this wonderful archive of photos and memorabilia and so forth, and she's been using it to craft exhibits. Right now, she's got an exhibit that shows the mock mobilization that took place in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia at about this time. And so each in the coming months, Jenny will do more that will basically track the Lakeside unit 100 years ago through its wartime experience. And so we felt it was appropriate, with the theme of war and remembrance of the Humanities Week, and our own interest in World War I, to find a scholar who would deal with the subject of medicine and the war. And it just happened that this was such a natural fit that I was very pleased. I actually heard Heather give a version of this talk in New Haven at the American Association for the History of Medicine last spring. So I was really impressed by the sources she used and the creativity of analysis. As you can see, the talk is entitled Feeding War, Gender Health in the Mobilized Kitchen in Germany. I don't think I'll belabor all your other publications, because this is what we were really here for tonight, but I will turn it over to you now. You're mic'd up and ready to go. Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Please, we will have a reception after the talk upstairs, and at the end of the talk, we'll start with some Q&A down here. I'll walk around with the mic so people can, pose their questions, and then we can adjourn up to the museum gallery for that reception. Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Jim, for that introduction, and also to everyone here at the District Medical Center who has been so helpful and wonderful in organizing things. Jennifer Nieves has helped me so much, and Laura Travis, and even Brandy and Catherine today, who are showing me things. I hope you get a chance to see this Lakeside Unit exhibit. It's really, really fascinating. Well, today, kind of talking to you about a project that I'm in the middle of, and raising some questions and trying to find out more about this. So I hope you'll bear with me. German women. England has also declared war on you. She is trying to starve out you and yours by blockading imported foodstuffs. Therefore, to arms. The life and death of the fatherland now hang no less on you, your loyal will, and your crafts and skills than they hang on victory out there in the battlefield. It was with these rousing words that the Wiesbaden Municipal Commission for National Nutrition set out to mobilize German women, mothers, daughters, and wives for war. Unlike their male compatriots, however, they were not being drafted into military service, nor were they being enlisted into the munitions factories, which for many of us have come to symbolize the wartime contributions of women. Rather, these women were being mobilized for duty within their own private homes. In 1915, Europe's Great War entered the German kitchen, and as the nation's men settled into the trench warfare, which has become so emblematic of this conflict, German women began their own war of attrition against privation, hunger, and the nutritional economy of food in Europe's first total war. The British blockade of Germany was initially a military one focused on seizing munitions and other war materials. However, over the fall of 1914, they gradually expanded their definition of contraband, and by the new year, England's Royal Navy was blocking, seizing, or sinking all imports to the German Empire. In January 1915, Germans started calling it the Hunger Blockade, a brutal English strategy designed to target civilians and starve the nation into surrender. And it was in response to this new situation that cities such as Wiesbaden were calling Germany's women to arms on the home front as kitchen soldiers. In the 100 years since then, hundreds of volumes have been written about the impact of the blockade on the German war effort, as well as the negative consequences it had on home front morale and support for the war. Thus, one might assume that these urgent calls to Germany's women would be brimming with dire predictions of the consequences that would follow such deprivation. So I was surprised to find that many of the nation's health and home experts were touting the nutritional benefits and opportunities for reform that the so-called hunger blockade was creating for Germans. Repeatedly, authorities pronounced that in spite of the growing shortage of some foods, the national population was in no danger of starving. Rather, they argued the war was actually revealing the gluttonous habits and misguiding eating patterns that Germans had been developing in recent years. Some authorities were arguing that it was time to return to earlier, more traditional food ways. Others focused rather on clarifying the health benefits of the war. In fact, a 1917 publication from the Minister of the War Foods Office remarked that the percentage of fat that some Germans had lost since the war broke out was a welcome sight indeed. Ultimately, my point here is that for many, the message that they were sending to Germans on the home front was that the conflict marked the chance to remake the German diet and to use food more efficiently for the fatherland. Now, today we might interpret this kind of rhetoric as simple object lessons in wartime propaganda designed to boost civilian morale. Others might read into this some foreshadowing of the intimate collaboration between biomedical authorities and the state that prevailed during the Third Reich. But tonight I want to focus on how emerging modern ideas about nutrition and bodily health were used to mobilize women during the war and ultimately contributed to the militarization of health and the medicalization of German society in the First World War. More specifically, I think that when we examine this predominantly female world of the home front, a world of kitchens, a world of meal preparation, a world of food management, that we can see here a new component of wartime mobilization, one which has been overlooked and which is deserving of more serious examination. A highly industrialized nation with a booming productive economy, the German Empire had become reliant on foreign imports to feed her population of 68 million. Cut off as she was from most of these outside sources from January 1915, and I've just kind of given you a brief small map here. The blockade started off as a distant blockade, but gradually the Royal Navy comes in to prevent all incoming traffic. Cut off from most of these outside sources by January 1915, the government realized that only by carefully managing their now limited domestic resources would the nation emerge victorious in the war. Almost immediately, they created two new offices to help with this, the War Raw Materials Office and the Central Purchasing Committee. I won't go into those, but they were offices largely concerned with the procurement and distribution of raw materials for munitions and military supply. But as the war shifted from one of movement to one of stalemate and attrition, and the blockade remained in place longer than anyone had initially anticipated, it was eventually food, its procurement, its management, its distribution, its storage, and its preparation, which became increasingly more valuable. And as the crisis loomed, many of the empire's food and home experts were ready to advise their nation at war. Nutritional science was born in the laboratories of German research universities in the mid-19th century. Through his experiments with humans and animals in the 1860s, the Munich chemist Karl von Voigt had discovered the basic laws of metabolism, thus establishing the foundations for nutritional chemistry and physiology. Indeed, Voigt is still considered by many to be the father of modern dietetics, and his pioneering studies on protein metabolism in the human body established for the first time the energy requirements and how to measure them. By the turn of the century, his student and intellectual successor, Max Rubner, had emerged as Germany's leading physiologist and nutrition expert. In 1913, he had helped to found the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Work Physiology in Berlin and subsequently became its director as well. In the years before the war, Rubner had been conducting research with the goal of determining the ideal diets, that is, the nutritional and caloric content, for optimizing the productivity of various professional and skilled workers. He was fascinated with trying to figure out how much energy the body needed and what ideal sources for this energy were, and how mental and physical work differed in their energy requirements. When the war broke out, Rubner saw the chance to use his knowledge in the service of the fatherland by advising civilians on the home front how best to maximize the food available to them. And I'm just kind of giving you some example of early nutritional studies, 1908 and 1909, questions of national nutrition, power and substance in nature's household. Well, Rubner and others argued that the key to successfully stretching the nation's food supply was not simply cutting back on the overall quantities of food that Germans ate. Rather, they argued Germans needed to eat more carefully so that they maintained their physical health and strength by consuming enough calories from each of the basic calorie groups: proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, while also being mindful not to overeat or waste specific food items that were growing or already were scarce. And though today we might take this kind of nutritional information as common knowledge, at the turn of the century, it was fairly rarefied scientific information, which had not circulated much beyond the laboratories and classrooms at universities and research institutes. Thus, educating Germans on these building blocks of nutrition, how to recognize them, which foods contained them, and how much the body needed, became Rubner's primary goal during the war. In public talks and essays, published addresses, exhibitions, and magazine articles, the nation's food and nutrition experts spent the war years trying to teach their compatriots how to eat more efficiently. Rubner and other nutritionists argued that despite being isolated from previous imports of grain from the United States and Russia, and as well as the fat and dairy products from their neighbors, that the population did not face starvation. In fact, they argued that in the years before the war, Germans had become accustomed to eating too much. Moreover, they thought Germans tended to eat out of habit and not from actual hunger. Eliminating snacks and making conscious decisions to consume smaller quantities of more satiating foods rather than ones that they had scientifically proven to be less satisfying would help Germans to be more efficient while also feeling fuller on less food. Also, learning how to use food and substitute ingredients while still preserving the taste and nutritional value of standard dishes was another key lesson, which Germany's nutritionists were certain, if taken to heart by the nation, would help in combating the hunger blockade. Focusing on ways to substitute other carbohydrate-rich foods for the imported wheat grain that Germany could no longer access, nutritionists suggested rye, potatoes, and other root vegetables as alternate ingredients for breads and baked dishes. And it is from these suggestions that the potato or rye-based recipe for K-brot, war bread, stemmed. Though rejected by most Germans at first as too dry and unappetizing, war bread grew in popularity as citizens realized that these qualities were what enabled the bread to remain fresher and last longer than most white flour loaves. And here you see one of these kind of propaganda postcards suggesting that K-bread, Kriegsbrot, is what's going to help win the war and sustain. In addition to substituting for wheat, Rubner argued Germans to grind rye and barley that they did have to a much finer grain so that it could stretch further. Other home front authorities helped in swaying public opinion for the bread as well. Take, for instance, the Hanover pastor Bernhard Dürres, who not only urged his flock to consume the war bread as part of their national duty, but also reassured the good people of Kleefeld that it was what God wanted them to do. As fats became scarce, they urged citizens to substitute sugar and fruit purees for butter and baked goods and to use margarine or other substitutes when frying. You see here the image of the sturdy potato and K-bread leaves that are all part of helping Germans to withstand the war effort. Well, nutritionists were also concerned about the protein that Germans consumed. According to one report, Germans ate far more red meat than was necessary, and they were urged to cut back on its consumption so as not to waste protein. Unlike fats and carbohydrates, they admonished the nation's citizens. Excess protein could not be stored in the body as reserve energy, but rather was excreted in urine. Thus, Germans who ate more than they actually used per day were wasting it. In fact, Rubner and others were very concerned that the empire's overabundance of swine was working against the population's carbohydrate resources, and in 1915 urged that 9 million pigs be slaughtered in order to preserve the fodder, that is, the rye, corn, and barley, which they argued could ultimately be used to feed twice as many Germans as animal meat could. So if you've heard of the famous 1915 pig massacre, that's what I'm talking about. Carl van Noorden, an expert in diabetes nutrition and regulation, argued that in recent decades, protein consumption had risen drastically, and that in particular, he was concerned that worker families ate too much of it. Nutritionists also campaigned to convince Germans that skim milk should not be feared, and that it had the same protein and nutrients as whole milk, and thus they could use it for cooking, baking, and, if you were an adult, even drinking. This was a practice which contravened most Germans' assumptions and perceptions that skimmed milk was only suitable for livestock. Mothers were urged to breastfeed infants so as to impart important nutrients to them and not rely on cow's milk for those who could still be nursed. And indeed, they received extra rations in order to support their body's milk production. Of course, these nutritionists did not expect citizens to starve, but they rather urged them to replace protein sources with legumes and fish, both of which were richly available and grew or reproduced quickly. One outlier even went so far as to suggest that it was more patriotic, expedient, and nutritious to drink domestic wine rather than beer, because, as he pointed out, the land being used for growing barley and hops would be much better for growing wheat, while most landscape being used by Germany's vintners was suitable for little else. Well, in addition to enlightening Germans on food science and the significance of recognizing and weighing the nutritive and caloric value of the food they ate over such other characteristics as taste or preference, nutritionists also began looking to park wardens and other agricultural and green space stewards for help in educating Germans on how they might best make use of personal or city gardens. Pamphlets such as this one from the district gardener in Ingolstadt in Bavaria, Heinrich Schäfer, informed Germans how they might use their gardens and other small land holdings to help the nation weather the hunger blockade. In this one, How Can I Use My Garden Today?, it was more than just a motivational pamphlet. In it, Schäfer instructed Germans on how to cultivate and make arable the so-called wastelands around them, fields and other grounds which, for whatever reason, lay unused and vacant. Germans who were not farmers by vocation could learn in the pages of How Can I Use My Garden Today? How to plan out garden plots, to optimize land use, ensure healthy water drainage, how to create their own fertilizer through composting, and perhaps even raise small animals such as rabbits or guinea pigs for food. Schäfer also included information on how Germans might preserve their garden produce in long-term storage by creating damp sand beds or Erdmiete in cool basement cellars. So I couldn't find an image of one from 1915, but this concept of storing root vegetables in sand in the basement in order to sort of prevent them from rotting, or these Erdmiete, and the best way to translate that would be earth piles or earth heaps. And it was again a way to kind of protect and store vegetables through the winter. Well, indeed, as this last section on food storage indicates, Germany's food experts found themselves not just educating the nation's citizen on nutrition and food production, they also found themselves needing to instruct civilians on the home front how to store their provisions properly. In the era before widespread refrigeration, few urban dwellers knew how to preserve their food, nor did they have the resources to do so. Many were unaccustomed to having extra food which they needed to store. And when, for instance, the iron ration was introduced in Berlin, it failed as much for lack of food knowledge as discipline. The iron ration was a week's worth of potatoes that was allotted to civilians, and which and was supposed to be held in reserve until the municipal authorities allowed its consumption. So on the home front, the iron ration very much mirrored the iron rations that soldiers carried with them as their food of last resort, and which was only to be consumed when permitted by their commanding officer. By providing all of the city dwellers with a food reserve, the government could permit the consumption of the iron ration on those weeks when, due to weather or fuel shortages or military operations, there was interference with regular food transports, and they could later replenish these individual stores when they arrived. Unfortunately, no one had instructed Berliners on the art of rotating out older potatoes from the reserve pile for newer ones. Thus, Berliners simply put their original allotment of the iron ration aside, only to find them shriveled, moldy, bug-infested, or covered in eyes when they reached for them months later. So teaching Germans how to stretch, preserve, and otherwise store their precious resources became another task of nutritional advisors. By 1916, their speeches and publications included descriptions on where and how to store root vegetables, fruits, dried meats, herbs, and other victuals. These foods did not last long, they informed Germans, in small, crowded, dark spaces, like the window boxes or kitchen crates that most people used. If an airy room in the apartment with ventilation, shelves for crates, and hooks for smoked or dried meats was not available, they urged them to consider converting space in building cellars or attics for such a purpose. They also began suggesting that building code regulations be changed in order to mandate the construction of larders in all apartment and tenement buildings. Thus, over the course of the war, nutritionists unexpectedly found themselves in conversation with housing authorities and slum reformers. Well, all of these suggestions for reforming the foodways, however, were essentially useless if experts such as Rubner and Schaefer could not convince every one of the nation's 12 million households to adopt them. Moreover, they knew that suggestions, which included fundamentally changing daily habits, breaking with regional traditions, learning to acquire new tastes, and even altering favorite family recipes, stood little chance of being adopted without the help of one important segment of society: the German Hausfrau. It was the housewife who chose the menu, did the shopping, prepared the food, and received the family's praise or criticism regarding the daily meals. And in spite of all the monumental changes that the war had wrought, it had not changed this. Indeed, with so many men away at war, many women found themselves in charge of not just the kitchen, but now were heads of household as well. Thus, when nutritional advisors and food reformers deliberated how they might best accomplish this re-education, they turned to Germany's women. By 1915, it had become clear to them that urgent yet vague directives from the government to be sparing or eat less did little to regulate effectively the consumption of Germany's food resources. It was not enough, nutritional advisors discovered, to make speeches urging families to cook and eat frugally. Rather, they realized that women needed specific and handy information on substituting foods, saving fats, recycling leftovers, cooking unfamiliar dishes, and home growing some of their own ingredients. Indeed, they found out, rather unfortunately, that in the absence of such a regimented and precise instruction, that the wealthier segment of society was saving by buying up huge quantities of cheap food supplies, thus making the remaining food altogether unaffordable for most of the population. Moreover, because they were unfamiliar with many of these new substitute ingredients or fuel-sparing preparation measures, frugal-minded housewives on the home front had been reluctant to experiment with the little food they had. So soon, nutritionists began working with women's groups to organize classes, public lectures, cooking demonstrations, and regular publications aimed at housewives and domestic workers to instruct them more properly in war cuisine. In Berlin, women's groups worked together with the medical community to host lectures and exhibitions on how to cook using different fats, while in Hamburg, authorities organized groups which could visit the estates of wealthy Germans in order to instruct the entire household staff in these measures. They urged cities around the empire to create home economic advice centers where women could get practical information, and model war kitchens where recipes could be tested and demonstrated to local residents. Here you see some images for some of the activities. This poster here says, "Save soap, but how?" And then gives some instruction and shows where they will meet. This one is an advertisement for a slideshow on how to use wild vegetables and herbs, how to recognize them so that you could go gather them on your own, or not inadvertently choose poisonous ones. Germany's National Women's Service published advice in local newspapers, including their 7 rules for war cuisine. And I won't go through all 7, but you can see at the very top was "Eat the war bread." But also to cook potatoes with the peels on, or to be clever and save fat. Researchers in both university laboratories and food industries began conducting experiments for how to stretch calories, and probably profited in doing so. In fact, Maggi and Knorr sauce mixes, which some of you may know Maggi or Knorr, are just 2 of the commercial products which were put forth by erstwhile food experts as useful fat-sparing meal enhancers. War cuisine, as the tactics and strategies of frugal cooking and household management came to be called, was a constantly evolving set of practices and information which changed as food supplies rose and dwindled, more often dwindling, over the course of the war. Thus, it was not a one-time educational task. It was conceived as an undertaking that required continual updating and readjustment. And one of the best ways to do this was through the regular publications put out by regional chapters of the German Housewives Union. Here's an example of a war cookbook, and this was, we'll notice, is by Lena Weininger, who was a housewife, right? And that's supposed to be part of a statement of her credibility for why this particular cookbook is good. Founded 1 year into the war by Hedwig Heil, the Housewives Union was organized as part of the campaign to instruct women in matters of household management. Although Hedwig Heil had been active in educating working-class Berlin women in such matters before the war, she was spurred into action in 1915 to found the DHB by the need to create a reliable network for informing women in the empire quickly and efficiently. In fact, Heil's efforts at educating and helping the German people to stretch and preserve their food were so instrumental that her fame carried across the Atlantic and throughout the United States. In St. Louis, Baltimore, Norwich, Connecticut, and even as in this article from the El Paso Herald, Americans could read articles about the most powerful woman in Germany and how she was preventing starvation among her people. Not only was she continuing her publication of useful cookbooks as she had before the war, but she had converted many of her late husband's chemical plants and manufactories into canning centers for preserving fruits and vegetables. And in some of these articles, the claim is even made that it was Heil's idea to move to a system of food rationing, although I haven't found anything to substantiate that. Thus, this idea that she is somehow single-handedly running this food conservation effort. Well, over the course of the war, the German Housewives Union affiliates put out dozens of cookbooks and instructional pamphlets, all designed to keep German housewives appraised of developments in nutrition, war cuisine, frugal household management, and patriotic cooking. Elsewhere, domestic science schools and their students were enlisted as collection stations for fruit, stones, and nuts. Here's another one of these cookbooks. What's kind of interesting about this one is that you'll see that it's put together by both a housewife and a nutritionist, right? So you're seeing this kind of way in which your average uneducated woman is working with a very educated authority. Oh, there we go. As this poster from the War Committee for Oil and Fats tells us, Berliners could earn 10 pfennig for every kilo of cherry, apricot, and plum stones that they turned in, or even 35 pfennig for each one of lemon or orange. And as you can also see, this is all taking place at the household school, so these spaces of education which are now joining in this effort. The National Women's Service also posted information about how best to use or reuse what before the war had been considered kitchen waste or animal feed. This poster here on the left suggested new uses for potato peels, while this one on the right not only reminded housewives to dry out their allotment of rutabagas, but also included instructions on how to do so. Aware that new and unfamiliar ideas which challenged local food traditions would be met with wary eyes and stomachs, the housewives' associations were careful to marry their cooking suggestions with regional practices in these war cookbooks. Thus, war cuisine was not a one-size-fits-all solution to the food problem during the blockade. Indeed, what we notice is that cookbooks for each region were specifically designed to include recipes for dishes that were familiar to local residents and which made use of native ingredients which were more likely to be available as well. For instance, cookbooks in Mecklenburg-Pommern and other northern areas, such as this one from the Baltics, usually included dishes with fish and dairy and with appropriate substitutes, while dishes in middle and southern areas such as Bavaria might include suggestions for meat-based dishes but which substituted rabbit or poultry for beef. This war cookbook, put together by Henrietta Fort for the City of Frankfurt's Food Commission, it even included an introduction from the Committee for Popular Nutrition, which had been formed by doctors from the local chapter of the Medical Association. In addition to these cookbooks, which, by the way, were largely distributed for free among German women, local newspapers often published weekly recipe suggestions to update area housewives on meals they could create from the rations available at the time. Thus, in contrast to these regional-oriented cooking advice, other publications also emerged, which were designed around specific cooking techniques, such as this one, instructing German women on how to cook with a Kochkiste. And the best translation I can find for that is a hay box or maybe a peat stove. And in some ways, it almost kind of reminds me of an early version of a crock pot. So you would boil up the food and cook it, and then while the pot was still hot, you would bury it in this case where it would be surrounded by straw or other kinds of stuffing, and that would enable the food to continue cooking even though you didn't have to use fuel. And I think there's one more slide. Yeah, this includes sorts of recipes for how to make best use of the Kochkiste, or how to make use of specific foods which Germans might not be familiar with. Take, for instance, this 1917 cookbook devoted to the rutabaga. Not only did the new Rutabaga War Cookbook include 50 different recipes for rutabagas, one of the few vegetables more readily available to Germans in 1917, and here you can see sort of the list of recipes, but it ordered these recipes around regional flavors and ingredients. In addition to the recipes, however, it also included a history of the rutabaga, a description of how best to store it before and after cooking, an explanation of how to best calculate the vegetable's nutritional value per pfennig spent. This is so the frugal housewife could carefully consider her weekly expenditures, and a chart of the daily nutritional requirements of the average man, woman, and child, and a table listing the nutritional value of some of the most commonly available foods. Thus, the new Rutabaga War Cookbook was more than just a cookbook. It was really designed as a kind of primer on nutritional science and frugal housekeeping, designed for these nations' kitchen soldiers, bringing together all of the knowledge that I've sort of spoken to you about. And as an aside, the fact that it's called the new Rutabaga Cookbook suggests to me there may have been a previous version. Haven't found that yet, but. Well, what does all of this matter, besides the fact that I find it interesting? Well, first, despite the characterizations of most military and political historians that the German Empire's food management was disorganized and irrational, I see here a fairly solid attempt at scientizing their approach to food rationing and allocations. And so, in terms of the 1915 pig massacre debate, I think that we can see a way in which there were a rationale put forth for killing these pigs, and that it was not just a wildly inappropriate and unfortunate decision by the government, as it's typically portrayed. Nutritionists such as Max Rubner were brought in specifically to lend their expertise to this enterprise, and they used the latest scientific information at their disposal to do so. So I think that in order to fully understand the impact of the blockade on Germany, we need to examine how it changed foodways and food practices. Moreover, any analysis of food and resource management in Germany at this time should also examine how popular conceptions of healthy eating and nutrition were influenced and even fundamentally transformed by the war experience. Right, and this is kind of another one of these interesting posters, which is German women think about England, right? And then the doctor informing them what are the best kinds of foods to eat. So nutritional advice that had not been available to women before, and which they would not even have understood, has over the period of 4 years been made understandable to them, and it's been a largely educational experience. But I also think this research suggests that there was a concerted and widespread effort to enlist women as what I'm calling these kitchen soldiers, homemakers whose daily choices could help or hinder a nation at war, and that at least some of them, such as Hedwig Heil, took this seriously as women's wartime service to the nation. Indeed, throughout the war, German women were consistently reminded how the daily choices they made when shopping, when cooking, when cleaning, were key not just to supporting the war, but indeed to the survival of the empire. Yet there remains very little research on Germany's kitchen soldiers. Just as compelling of this entire story that I've told to you today is the fact that when the War Foods Office was created in 1916 to deal with the food shortages, they actually created a women's advisory board, a political council for this wartime organization, and women such as Heil were part of that. But finally, perhaps most interesting to me is this question: what is the long-term impact of this scientization of the kitchen? For 4 years, the average German woman, who was largely uneducated in science, nutrition, physiology, and chemistry, was instructed in at least some rudimentary aspects of these fields. These women were also repeatedly reminded of their importance to the family, to the nation, and to the empire, and made aware of how significant their roles as mothers, cooks, shoppers, gardeners, and above all, homemakers were. What kind of lasting impact did this mobilization of the kitchen have? One of the reasons I find this mobilization particularly important and worth further study is that when we use this as a way to frame a historical study of German women's experience in the Great War, then we have the chance to actually expand more deeply our own understanding of German women's wartime efforts. But we also have the opportunity to examine what wartime consumer behaviors, domestic practices, and food associations remained entrenched among German women even after the guns of August fell silent. Because though the armistice was declared in November of 1918, the blockade remained in place until at least June 1919. That is, until Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles. And the scarcity of goods that resulted from it lasted even longer. Thus, Germany's kitchen soldiers actually continued their battles for food, sustenance, and survival at home long after their male counterparts had laid down their arms, making their practices part of Germany's peacetime experience as well. For Germany's women, peace still seemed in some ways not much different from the war. Thank you. Yes?
So, thank you for that's pretty deep groundwork. So to what extent was Germany impacted by the 1918 epidemic, and to what extent would this food approach have been deemed contributory in avoiding problems for Germany?
Interesting you should ask that question. The book I'm also working on is an examination of Germany's experience of the 1918 flu. And I haven't gotten very far in that. But first and foremost, right, the food deprivation had resulted in a fairly malnourished population. If we keep in mind that there are 3 waves of the flu in 1918, 1919, there's even still some flu in 1920, 1921, most of Germany's doctors are in the field, right, with soldiers. Most of any medicine they have is in the field with soldiers. So the home front has little food, little medical professionals, and little medical care. And at the same time, they're in the midst of a political revolution. So issues of public health would have been impacted not only by how by the health of the average German and the lack of availability of materials to kind of combat that, but also the lack of any kind of government infrastructure in order to organize that kind of public health. So I think it played a pretty big role, but I haven't finished that research to give you any kind of definitive conclusion. But what I think I might find is that those who are able to provide health care gain a greater legitimacy than those who can't. And that's a fairly typical conclusion, right? Those who can provide end up earning more popular trust. But I'll get back to you in about 2 years.
I've read that German cities, especially Berlin, suffered more than the countryside with the smaller towns. In fact, there was quite a bit of almost starvation in Berlin in late 1915. What have you found?
Well, yes. So the farmers in the countryside had all of this land available to them and could grow their own food. And even when the state was requisitioning it in order to make food deliveries, many farmers decided to hold food back, right, and to hide it. And then there were all kinds of instances of farmers who would rather kill their own cattle or pigs than to give it to the government for less than what they deemed a fair price. But also over the course of the war, it became increasingly difficult to transport what little food there was, right? So there are also issues of transport. There's also issues of keeping food from spoiling while transporting it, which is why part of what's the story, that I've talked about tonight is about figuring out how to use local foods that don't have to be transported. And in another version of this talk, I go into some of the urban war gardens. So many of them tried to get urban Germans to raise rabbits and guinea pigs and other ways to kind of raise their own food. But Germany, Berlin, is typically put forward as the kind of example par excellence of disorganized food management. It was worse really in the winter of 1617, the so-called turnip winter, because by then they had several bad harvests and bad weather. The blockade was going into its 4th year, and the impact of a war of attrition is that all of Germany's men, right, are being sent out to the front, which means there's nobody left to harvest what little crops are available. So in a book I just finished, I examine how orthopedists and modern medical rehabilitators work to enable disabled soldiers to go out in the fields and to cultivate and to do this work that able-bodied men aren't around to do. But it was definitely dire. I'm not going to try to pretend like this solved all of the food problems. Yes.
Knowing the importance of beer in German culture, what did the government, was there control of the production and the use of the resources, et cetera?
Yes, and I'm still working on that, because on the one hand you have these huge sort of beer firms which have the capacity and the materials and the equipment to do some of this food experimentation, like how can you use Gerst and how can you use hops. And so they get caught up on some level in working with that to sort of feed people. Of course, Germans then and now will tell you that there are a lot of nutritive ingredients in beer, right? That there's plenty of vitamins, that it's a very healthy food to drink. But there's also a moment, patches when alcohol is made illegal for a variety of issues of food control, and that also didn't go over well. So it was an issue. Beer and blood sausage. We've got all of this evidence of blood sausage. So they would try to water down beer and water down blood sausage by having more water than blood and meat. And they get to about a 50-50 ratio, and then the federal government steps in, and they won't allow them to save on ingredients any more than 50-50, because they know the Germans will revolt if their blood sausage isn't bloody enough, and if their beer isn't thick enough. So
I'm interested interested at this intersection of scientific education and household management. When and at what level was home economics introduced into the curriculum, presumably at the Hauptschule, but maybe at Höhere Töchterschule or whatever? When did medicalized dietary nutrition science come into the school curriculum to teach the next generation of housewives how not only to save but to maximize nutrition?
Yeah, that's stuff I'm also still working on. I mean, clearly that information is out there, and women like Hedwig Heil, who are sort of upper middle class, have had access to it. But the fact that there's still, the fact that she has formed all these organizations to transmit or circulate this knowledge among the working class suggests to me that there's a fairly wide differential. And I would have to, Germany, because it's decentralized, the empire is decentralized, there's not a kind of one rule for classes in all of the schools. I have to go back and look at Prussia and Saxony and stuff. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm looking at. I know that they're implementing it in a lot of places. They're implementing, so they have these Frauenschule, but the extent to which information on calories and on proteins are in there, I haven't been finding. What they're consistently saying in these cookbooks is that they're using them as a way to educate German women on this new things. They're still figuring out about vitamins too, right? They've only recently figured out what it is in lemons that keeps people from getting scurvy. So it's in this weird cusp of information. But I think that the war, I think that the war is what circulates that knowledge, which takes it from the male scientific realm, predominantly male, right? Women get in university by 1908, right? 1908, 96. In Prussia, genau, right? So this is what makes it popular, right? This sort of popularization of this knowledge. And it's still rudimentary, but I think it's significant. Yes?
So how much do you think that this realization of nutrition and modern science of food affected the actual rationing system of Germany? I know you mentioned that in 1916, that's when the official rationing system was set up, but that's more than 2 years into the war. Were they focusing more on the nutrition of food as opposed to the strict rationing of it early on, and then or how did that play?
Well, that is still some research that I need to work on. So rations were designed, I mean, the War Foods Office had a sort of broad metric, right, by which they were trying to calculate rations. So it wasn't, they were designed to meet the caloric needs minimum of the bodies that they were feeding, which is why workers in industry, munitions, got more rations than people who weren't doing that kind of heavy labor, or why women who were breastfeeding could get more rations than women who weren't. And so I think that it was very much guided. Now there's a certain point when there's just not enough food anywhere. Although even that is a little bit disputed, right? There's still a bunch of historians that argue whether or not it was really as dire as we like to make out. But they were on this. In the Beirat, a committee that was advising the War Foods Office, all of these nutritionists are on there, kind of adding their weight to it. So I think it was clearly a medicalized process. But all people ever talk about is the political administration of it. Yes?
I know that pickled and vinegar and that sort of preservation methods were probably used back then. But did cold packing, which I remember during the Second World War, my mother was doing from the garden, was that something that was used back in the First World War?
How do you mean?
Where you would can tomatoes and other vegetables. It's called cold packing because you sterilize the jars, put the stuff in it, boiled them, and then screwed the lids on.
Oh yeah. So I think of that as canning with ball jars. Yeah. So in fact, yes, they were figuring that out. I mean, once Pasteur kind of figures out pasteurization, that trickles down, and I can't remember the German word for that, but they are essentially doing that. It's jars and with lids. But they are. But then you have someone like Heil, right? Hedwig Heil, who comes around and wants to kind of do this on a mass scale in her husband's chemistry factory. So, those factories. So they're doing it, and they're encouraged to do that. They've got all kind. There are these cookbooks which give them instruction on how to do that.
Surely the farmers knew how to store beets and rutabagas and carrots and all that sort of stuff. But did the city people?
Well, that's why. So in a couple of the examples, that's exactly why they're writing these books, because the city people have no idea. Few have an idea how to do that. And that's for a variety of reasons. I mean, some of them are not used to having food. Right? I mean, you shop on your way home, or if you're a factory worker, you might eat at the cantina. Right, your big main meal for the day is at the cafeteria, right, the kitchen at the factory, and so they had to kind of learn how to do this and to plan ahead, and in some ways, right, these were techniques which had been forgotten by modern societies, and this is why there's a whole other group of agricultural reformers which eventually get involved, and they want to move Germans out of the cities and get them back on the land where they belong, but it's exactly that kind of stuff.
But on this point, some of it was based, I think, on the ability to pay in advance for food to store over a period of time.
Right.
But in 1985, I was living in Göttingen, which is not a large city by any stretch of the imagination, and I had an 82-year-old landlady. And in October, the local grocery store started filling up with 100-kilogram bags of Einkellerungskartoffeln. That's 220 pounds of potatoes, and Einkellerung means for sticking in your cellar during the winter so that you wouldn't have to walk back and forth with a pound of potatoes. And one day I found this 82-year-old lady with a dolly struggling to get this 220-pound sack of potatoes home, so of course I helped her with it, but there's not much you can do with 225 pounds. I had to enlist additional people to help. So that if you could afford it and it was available, there was still, even in cities, this practice of preparing for winter by laying up your acorns, as it were.
Right, yeah.
Potatoes disappeared.
I think so. I think, but there was definitely this effort. They had to educate them, because Berliners were constantly screwing this up, and they were not storing them right, and then they're...
Consider the audience. Consider the authors as well. There's a class distance often from these middle class and scientific critics of working class behavior.
Right.
The problem in the cities was that they didn't know how to keep food. In the farms, I can remember this growing up in the country, we all had we called them root cellars. And they were actually dug into the ground outside your house where you kept the potatoes and carrots, maybe rutabagas. Just a word, if I may. In this country, after the Civil War, we had the land-grant colleges in many states, and from New York State. And the whole idea of these colleges was to educate people and take it out to the public. And the extension service would go out and meet with people, I used to do that, and teach them how to cook food and make nutritious meals, even during peacetime. So that idea of teaching people how to eat was existed even in peacetime, in certain places, at least in this country. Did any of you recognize this story of what we went through in the Second World War, when we had the rationing, and we had books from the government on how to cook without sugar and butter? This is a wonderful program.
Victory Gardens.
Reminds me of so many other things.
What's really interesting is, when the Hoover Institute and a couple other American humanitarian groups and missionaries kind of go over to Germany to help out, they're writing back. I mean, they're taking this information and writing it up and sending it back to the U.S. government. And this is how the Germans survived. They are taking notes on this, as are the British. They are absolutely trying to learn. I mean, the British, they have to implement rationing really late, like 1918. They start to run out of food. But until the U.S. declares war, right? There's still a friendly relationship, which is why Heil is over here in America, kind of touring and showing off and sharing all of her strategies, and even in 1915, 1916. So, definitely.
Canning was started at the end of the 18th century in France. As you said, when Pasteur's theories were understood by people, and they have found canned goods from the era even now that are still okay to eat.
I'll let somebody else do that.
It's just one of those little things you read about in the history sometimes.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
I believe 1890s, at least commercial canning food.
Let's take one more question and then adjourn upstairs for some reception and some refreshments.
Yeah.
One more question?
Food. Mark.
Heather, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the political influence of Heil. I find she's a very interesting person. We know a lot about, and I don't know this personally, we know a lot about her influence in nutrition and science, but that committee that you recommended that was brought together to figure out how many pigs should be slaughtered, she was on that government committee. So she's playing sort of what we call the male big leagues, and I'm wondering what other sort of political influence she had in Germany.
It's interesting. So she was in her 60s at this point, and while she's not discussing female politicization, what I found really fascinating is all of the articles about Heil that I found published either in England or in the United States took the moment to recommend that, or took the moment to note that Heil was not fighting for female emancipation or the women's vote. And so while I think she was kind of an old school Hamburger liberal, she's still very much that kind of, I imagine she's very much that middle class, right? Because she doesn't want every woman to have the vote. And so I just found that fairly interesting, that at least the way she's presenting herself in the U.S., she's not presenting herself as a suffragist who is out politicking in that way. But Gertrude Boehmer was also involved with a lot of this stuff, and she becomes significantly politicized. And Belinda Davis's book, which is kind of all about how food riots are female politicization. But I think Heil might have just been that kind of older generation.
That was my sentiment.
I mean, I'm. If you know where her Nachlass is, just let me know.
I know she set up a school in the 1880s and 1890s already, and there's a school in Frankfurt named after her, Haushaltsschule, today. Even I think it's still in business.
Yeah, she's a pretty, and she becomes more and more interesting the more I learn about her. So.
Well, let's all thank Heather for a fascinating look at the World War.
Thank you.